Hello, friends, brothers, ladies, gentlemen, and friends beyond the binary. My name is Tristan. Welcome to Step Back Today, a wonderful little show that I do on Monday afternoons where I talk with y'all about stuff and things and do it for a day show because I love this. I love everything about it. This is great. So I do this show. So Step Back Today I do on Monday afternoons from noon till 2, typically in America time, so that I have a show that hits most of the time zones of one of the two streams I do every week. This one is kind of for all of y'all in Europe land or anyone who's kind of on that side of the Atlantic. So welcome. We're going to have a real good time today. Couple things I just want to mention before we get started. I have a couple projects I'm working on that I want you guys to know about. Is this a Nazi channel? Hell no. Very much the opposite. If there is anybody who is new to the chat for the first time, please let yourself be known in the chat because everybody here is very warm and welcoming, and I would love for you guys to feel welcomed. I recognize Jennifer Loves Screw It, who is a common sight in the Twitter notifications, so that's good news. So I'll talk about a couple things that are going on in the channel. A couple things. I'm working on 2 videos at the moment. Bit of a weird superposition for where these 2 videos are. I know that it's been a little bit since the videos come out, and I appreciate your patience on this because this shakeup in my YouTube schedule is tied to making more high quality content, and I'm still getting a feel for how long projects are supposed to take in the way that I'm doing them now. And with things like sponsorships that I've agreed to and things like that, figuring out how much time a project needs to get done is getting complicated for me. So I just hope you know that, like, right now I'm just working on it, trying to get there. But at the moment I have 2 projects in production, one of which hopefully will be coming out this week. One of which, I don't know which one, but I'm working on a video for the religion series on good old Shinto, and I'm working on a brief history of Brazil. So we've got a good pair of videos coming out for a wonderful new series. So do you see some new people? Asmo, welcome. You were asking if if this was a Nazi channel, so I imagine that this you must be new. Anybody else? Anyone else who's new? Another thing I want to mention is that my partner Kelly is in the chat taking down the questions so that I can get to them, because I used to do it on my own and I would get very distracted. But some other things that have been going down. One very normal thing that happened to me this week is I got recognized on the street again, which this is happening more and more often these days, actually. I'm getting up to this is now the 4th incident in which I've been randomly recognized on the street, and 3 of them happened this year. So I'm not sure what's going on, but it's been, even though these things are happening more and more often, I still seem to be a little bit at a loss for, a little bit at a loss as to what to say and what to do, and to not just sound like a weirdo who just says thank you and asks for their name and asks them about stuff. So, working on that. Also, last Monday, actually, I got to go to the studios for Thought Cafe. So, for anyone who doesn't know, Thought Cafe is the animation studio that does the animations for the cartoons for Crash Course. and they're based out of Toronto. And so I got to go and hang out with them and see them and talk business with them, and it was really, really fun. I got to watch like 12 people working on a single Crash Course episode with like or several Crash Course episodes actually, but like 12 people working on Crash Course episodes with like all sorts of projects. Like I got to not watch a video, but I got to see the kinds of things that are going on for future Crash Course videos. I thought that was really cool. Especially because there's a series coming down the pike. I think it might have been announced on Friday. I'm not sure. I haven't checked the Crash Course page, but my friend Jabril is actually going to be hosting it, which is kind of cool. Other than that, Romeo, the cat who was right here, I don't know where he went. He'll turn up. He turned 4. Or at least it's been 4 years since we got him. We brought him home, so I think it actually makes him closer to 5. Yeah. So that's fun. What else? And the last thing I have to mention is I got a question on the dirtbag left from my curious cat that I think was worth expanding upon. Especially in the wake of the shooting in Dayton that happened yesterday, where it's becoming more and more apparent that the person who committed the shooting was a self-described socialist, but somebody who had a long history of anger management problems and hatred and violent thoughts towards women. Like very like vicious misogyny. And then I got that question about the dirtbag left the other day, and I was like, oh, this should be a thing about how masculinity is a bit of a messed up thing, and that myself and many other men are trained to think about the world in ways that are not healthy and are really violent and taken to their logical extreme, and that we really should back away from that and try and reassess what these things mean. I did a Twitter thread about it last night in the middle of the night, and I think let me just look it up here because I want to get my words out in a way. I will say there is a difference between this and the El Paso shooting that happened 12 hours earlier or whatever, because the El Paso shooting was an explicitly political act of terrorism. It was done by a white nationalist who released a manifesto before doing it. The shooting in Dayton looks like it was more of like there was not like much of a blah, like I'm trying to think about how to explain it. It was much less of a like there was no manifesto. It was very much a like misogynist thing. Like they're picking through basically his life to try to find out what caused him to do the things that he did. And it seems that it has a lot to do with the fact that he had very, very violent thoughts towards women. Okay. So, and it brought back to the fact that a couple days ago in a stream, I said that people should, if they want to become leftists, if they want to become activists, that one of the first things they should do for their own well-being and for their long-term personality should get involved with other people offline. And talking about how for Gen Zers and millennials, this is one of the most, like the amount of people who report having few to no friends is staggeringly high. And loneliness is becoming a predominant cultural factor, which is very toxic. I think we're learning, especially with men. Men report a higher level of having fewer friends than women do in this situation. And this kind of loneliness and alienation combined with toxic masculinity and this unrealistic depiction of what sex is like, both like what the culture of sex is like, is turning into this really nasty concoction that I think is leading to a lot of people going into the far right and going into or committing mass murder, like what happened in Dayton just yesterday as well. And I do think that online radicalization is something that we need to confront, because there are many, many studies that show that if you predominantly interact online, and the more that you restrict your activities and your social life to the online space, you end up with lower empathy, radicalization, and tend to have a lack of respect for the humanities of others, which I know is tough to get involved with. Mental illness is definitely a thing, and that can be a paralyzing set of things to get stuck into. But I also would argue that our society in general fosters almost everyone to have a sense of low self-esteem and social anxiety. And that I think that one of the things you would notice is that the very few people who have either addressed their social anxiety and low self-esteem, or who are somehow blessed with not having issues related to self-esteem and social anxiety, almost appear to have like superpowers of charisma. And so I do think that this sort of toxic brew that's like imposed on humanity is just a rough situation, if you know what I mean. But it is a thing that is tougher, but needs to like be picked up, and it needs to be pushed further. This is why joining and making a group of friends with diverse backgrounds is important, and meeting them in meet space, as people would say, is important. Like, even if it's just like, I think I mentioned in the Twitter thread, even if it's just getting into like a D&D group or something, just anything that gets you spending time with people with different experiences than you. This is one of the reasons why I think going to post-secondary education is good if you can do it. Just learn to be close with different types of people. And yeah, I know there are a lot of millennial and Gen Z men who feel lonely and mad and looking to blame somebody for all the things going wrong in their life. I know, because when this was me, I typically blamed myself for this. And yeah, just try to get away. Try to do something. That's the stuff that I want to impeach upon all of you people. That's the stuff I want to get out there. Yeah, and I don't like the way that the dirtbag left, at least the way that I would interpret, like, the thing is, like, the dirtbag left is like a media confab to rack in a whole bunch of people together, and a lot of them are, in my mind, closer to being fascists or reactionaries than they are to socialists, but and use oppressive language and, like, really, like, use like nasty dehumanizing stuff and punch down. And in my mind, punching down is wrong. I mean, it's not wrong to have enemies. We live in a society where class warfare exists. There are people whose economic interests are mutually exclusive to our own, and they hold the levers of power. And there is no way to really change their minds. They will need to be defeated. But that extending to other situations can be like the idea of punching down and hurting those who are more vulnerable than you, even if you're doing it quote 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 ironically. It's not cool. That's all I can say to that. Okay, I'm starting to see a lot of questions out there. Fun. Okay. I'm sure that sparked a whole lot of people wanting to say things and react to that statement. So, okay. So, first things first. Do you have opinions or thoughts on Richard Wolff? He's a professor of economics and teaches Marxism. He hosts Democracy at Work and Economic Update. Yes. As far as I've seen, Richard Wolff's a pretty good, accessible Marxist economics professor. His pop economics is pretty good. His description of Marxist principles in accessible language is pretty solid. Yeah, I don't see any problem with him. But I mean, like, every time I say that I'm afraid to say I like something or someone because, I don't know, he might secretly have some super shitty opinion that I didn't know about. But Economic Update was a podcast I listened to for a little while until I basically had to really tone down on the amount of podcasts I had, so I had to drop it. But yeah, Richard Wolff's good. In his book Utopia for Realists, Rutger Bregman asserts that a peasant in the Middle Ages would probably consider our world a utopia. Agree or disagree? Perhaps at first. Definitely. The whole basic medical care and nutritious food and the basics of life being handled compared to today are would be considered utopic ideals. That is for sure. Live here for a few years, maybe things will change, but yeah, as far as like straight material condition, yeah, the advances in technology have allowed for the average person to live like kings if they had lived 1,000 years ago, which is interesting, but doesn't have a ton of, I don't know, like, that just feels like a word that might be used for, that might just be, it just feels like a thing that's like used to like say, don't ask for anything better. Don't you, like, you should just be happy with how much more you have, which I think is like, you know, that's yeah. In yesterday's stream with Ina, you seemed very uncomfortable. Did you feel you can't criticize a faith without being bigoted? Is there such thing as you being too PC? This is something that Kelly said too, that I felt tense, that she felt tense listening to it, especially when I got called out from my ISIS video. And I don't think, I didn't feel uncomfortable. I did know that I was in a situation in which we were having I think that like we more or less agreed on a lot of things, but we had different points of view when it came to semantics and like approach. And so if I came across as quote unquote uncomfortable, it was more because in such a situation, I needed to, like, when you're talking about what language you use, when you're trying to have that kind of discussion, you have to be very surgical and very precise in the word usage you have. So that means that you have to use a few more brain cycles to try and work through the language that you're using, which could have come across as me being uncomfortable. I do think that we might not see eye to eye on just how negative a force religion is in the world, but that's perfectly entitled to have that. She's perfectly entitled to have that opinion, and it's not super incorrect. I just happen to be a little less emphasis on that part of life. I don't, despite me having a world religion series, I don't think about religion as much. I think it's a lower priority in my my activist issues and my academic interests. To me, I'm interested. I see religion more as a cultural, geopolitical category that that is based on historical context and stuff like that, and that's it's just a different way of looking at the same thing, though. So I don't know. I didn't feel very uncomfortable. The next part of your question, though, is, did you feel like you can't criticize a faith without being bigoted? Is there such a thing as you being too PC? Did I feel like I can't criticize a faith without being bigoted? In my mind, it's tough to criticize a religion from the outside, because you tend to not understand the nuances on the inside of it. And on top of that, you're wading into a discussion that you don't have a ton of stance in. Like, if you're gonna start saying about why X religion is bad as an outsider, what are you accomplishing other than talking what are you accomplishing other than either making them cloister up and defend themselves against an outside threat, or fomenting dangerous ideas about repressing groups of people based on their religion, which is tied to all sorts of things, as we talked about with race and nationality and identity and things like that. And so in my mind, me not being in the case of the thing, not being a Muslim and not being a Muslim, not being even part of a Muslim community, not being an ex-Muslim or anything like that, I don't think I have much of a leg to stand on when it comes to talking about Islam. And so my thinking is, I'm not a person who thinks that we need to make all of Islam go away. It's not a thing that's going to be possible. And so we need to look at it more from the perspective of, how can you be a Muslim and be a modern person and have progressive political ideas and encourage that kind of thinking. That's the way that I would look at it. As far as is there such thing as you being too PC? I think the term PC, as I said in my political correctness video, has little meaning beyond it being a right-wing snarl word. Political correctness comes from the international left during the Cold War, in which the politically correct stance was to support the Soviet Union in whatever they were doing. And if you disagreed with the Soviet Union as a leftist, you were violating, you were being politically incorrect. Because the politics was the politics of the Soviet Union. Then a lot of the people who very much had the Trotskyists who left the socialist movement and turned into the beginnings of the neoconservative flock have adopted said language and have turned it more or less into a completely empty right-wing snarl word, just to say that being pro human rights and not wanting to dehumanize people worse off than you is somehow you just avoiding the truth because you don't want to have the fucking bell curve debate all over again. And I don't think that that's a useful category of analysis. So that's where I go on that. What's next? Can you make a video about the history of Japan and its politics? Because the samurai medieval fascist background of Japan is pretty interesting and the culture is fascinating. Well, Canadian Fuhrer, Emperor Jackson, I don't have a ton of, I'm doing a little bit of that. I'm working on a video about Shinto right now, so there's going to be a little bit of it in that. But, like, Japan's interesting. I'm sure the winds of fate will bring me there at some point. Although, like, most of the time I try to keep into areas that I have a little bit of knowledge about already, but that should not be a thing going forward. So that should not be a thing that stalls me. I should be able to go and wade into more research, but it will mean more research and learning about things that I have no idea about, and means that if I go into a subject where I don't have even a passing familiarity, it means that I'm going to have to do a lot more research just to understand what I'm writing about. And the chances of me getting getting something wrong go up, which I'm nervous about. Not so serious question. Roast beef commercial or French dip? I don't know what roast beef commercial is, so I'll just go with French dip. Okay. Your idea of socialists setting up their own alternative gift economy online, wouldn't most of the stuff be exchanged ultimately come from capitalist manufacturers? To an extent. It depends upon how this alternative system would be structured. In my mind, it's not really about capitalist, it's not really about the sourcing of where it comes from as much as it is about trying to get as much of economic activity done within the system as possible. So in my mind, somebody who would be signed up with such an alternate economy would not necessarily be relying entirely upon it for all of their daily goods. I think that you would need to get to a certain point for that to be available. And you would also need, you would need to get some parts of that economy to the point where primary industries are able to give to said system. In my mind, that there's like a turning point of users that would need to happen before that happens. So in my mind, this would be more about trying to reduce the amount of use of capitalist stuff. And in many times, if you can avoid like if you're a beer brewer, for example, and you give your services of brewing beer as part of the alternate economy, then yeah, you might still need to go to a capitalist source to buy the barley and the yeast and the hops and the stuff you need to make it. But you're cutting out a little bit of beer manufacturing from the economy, and you're cutting into Budweiser's profits a little bit. And in my mind, whatever you can do is better than not doing it, and that it's a thing that could start off with very simple favors and things like that and could develop into something a lot more sophisticated later on. But yeah. Why do you have an Antifa flag? This is more than just an Antifa flag. This flag is flag is an anarchist flag. stands for the red and black stand for black being anarchism and red being socialism. And it has shown up in many anarchist movements throughout the years. There was like the anarchists during the Spanish Civil War wore it. And yeah, Antifa super soldiers now probably use a similar flag today. But it's all part of the same intellectual heritage of being for justice and against fascism. So I would like to consider myself part of said tradition if I could. Are you aware one of the victims was his sister? Yes. I did hear that. Why has Vouch been welcomed as a bread tuber in the general overall leftist YouTube space? Well, some random geek. It's a good question. I don't consider him a very nice or good person and not somebody I really want to be associated with. Unfortunately, the term bread tuber is so loose and vague and doesn't really have gatekeepers, so anyone can call themselves one. And I don't like, in my mind, that is why like the bread tuber category feels a little empty now, especially when like shitty people who punch down and just seem to think that being cruel and being like just being cruel and unsympathetic is somehow a badge of honor, and that's not something I really want to be somebody I associate with. And you know what? None of the people I associate with think Vouch is good. So, and I would like it to continue that way if I could. Was this guy a tanky? No, I don't think he was a tanky. I don't exactly know, but we'll see. He looked like, I saw a little bit of a Wayback Machine capture of his Twitter account, and it seemed like he was a general irony poisoned internet person. One Punch Taco asks, is there any political drama going on in Canada like in the US? Not like in the US. Canada's going through some weird stuff at the moment. We have a election in October, and right now, Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, has spent 4 years basically taking a giant shit on everybody who voted for him. And so it's coming down to whether people are more scared of the Conservatives coming into power than they are of voting for somebody who has literally lied to your face and saying, I like a person who literally promised to fix the issues in Canadian democracy with the vote with the electoral system and said, actually, no, now that I'm in power, I don't care anymore. On top of that, there is a growing and festering far-right movement in Canada with the Yellow Vest movement, with the Three Percenters, with the Sons of Odin, stuff like that. So far-right fascism is becoming more and more prevalent, and we haven't had an election since 2016, so we don't know how gross things are going to get. But given that in like almost every single election, save one since 2016, every provincial government has swapped to the far right in one way or another, doesn't bode well. And at the same time, there's a new far-right Canadian political party called the People's Party that's led by a fascist by the name of Maxime Bernier. And he's currently not being taken seriously as a politician. But we'll see, because I think that the far-right is getting frustrated with Andrew Scheer. So we'll see where things go from there. Okay. So there's that. I watched a history vid that said the Cuban Revolution, new doctors had to spend time in poor parts of the island before they can move on with their career. Thoughts on that policy? Sounds good to me. Whatever they're doing in Cuba works, because, like, Cuba has, like, one of the best medical systems in the world, so there's that. How can one acknowledge Christianity is inherently homophobic, Islam and Judaism are inherently misogynistic without falling into the racist, bigoted pothole of the skeptics? In my mind, it's about... in my mind, I would say focus on the homophobia instead of talking about the... Okay, in my mind, there's two ways you can go down. One, condemn homophobia, no matter who says it, no matter where it comes from. In my mind, a homophobic bigot who is an atheist is just as bad as a homophobic bigot who is a Christian. Those two things are, in my mind, where your bigotry comes from doesn't really matter to me. Then, when it comes to the actual changes in religion and things like that, and like criticizing the homophobic text in the religion and things like that, in my mind, it's not really productive to say, like, in my mind, I could, like, if I came up and said, the Bible and Christianity has tons of homophobia, therefore it's bad. What does that accomplish? Do I think that do you think that criticizing Christianity as an outsider is somehow going to make all of the Christians suddenly, like, look at the book and be like, oh my God, it totally is homophobic. I never guessed. And also, if you think that people are homophobic, like, in my mind, people aren't like, I'm a normal everyday chum. Nothing, I'm not bigoted in any way whatsoever. And then they get a religion and that makes them homophobic. Like, I think that there's a cart before the horse issue there. But either way, if you want to try and be constructive about the criticisms of a religion, which, you know, it's nothing wrong about having criticisms about the text of a religion. Just know that religion's a lot more large and nuanced than that. But encouraging reform in said religion instead of just condemning it. Because, like, for example, if you wanted to get homophobia out of Christianity, the answer is not going to be to make the largest religion on earth all of a sudden give up their religion. Like, that's not a thing you're going to accomplish. You know, no matter what you guys say, there are going to be Christians long after all of us are dead. There's no... by not proposing a solution for these things, you are by being not constructive, you are more or less either trying to force people to give up an identity that people have shown that they would rather die than give up, which means you're for either ostracizing these people or you're advocating for genocide. To be like Islam is bad and irredeemable and all these things, and then just be like, we need to do something about it. Like, what does that say? What are you trying to say? And so in my mind, I would be more about trying to advocate for reform in those religions. Be constructive. Try to push, like, the Christian church has... Every single Christian denomination has people working within said denomination to liberalize and make the religion more tolerant and accepting. Like, trust me, there are like movements within the Anglican Church, within the Catholic Church, within the Lutheran Church, who are trying to make it, trying to change the way that canon is interpreted to make it accepting to other people. And in my mind, let them do that. Let them do that and encourage them. Because as an outsider, just saying you're bad and need to be dealt with is not going to accomplish anything. Why is being radicalized bad? I was radicalized by the Israeli anarchist movement. Radicalization brings people together for a common cause, be it Occupy Wall Street or Antifa. I think we're getting into different definitions here. I think that radicalizing, in the way that I spoke about it, is about the bringing people into a totalizing movement that sees outsiders as irredeemable and in need of being basically destroyed or defeated. And if you go down that rabbit hole for too long, you do start advocating for the death of people, which is not good. And so that is why I would say that there is an issue with radicalizing in the terms of like waking up and noticing about how the world is unjust and hurts people, and actually, in my mind, talking about how radicalized our society is against poor people, against people of color, against women, against LGBTQ plus people. In my mind, becoming an anarchist is de-radicalization in a really, really weird way. Because becoming becoming a left-wing anarchist is about getting rid of systems that dehumanize others, that create false enemies, that create false categories that are imposed and don't accomplish anything. While becoming a fascist is taking all of those categories and all those oppressions that the world has imposed on people and making them even bigger and more impermeable. When I would argue you should tear all of those down. All right. Do you think Gene Roddenberry was a socialist, or do you think the case that it's really difficult to come up with a vision of utopia that won't end up being socialistic? I thought I heard that Gene Roddenberry was pretty socialist. I could be wrong. That could just be an urban legend. But I do think that, as you said, it's kind of hard to imagine a post-scarcity economy that still keeps capitalism. Capitalism and post-scarcity economies seem completely incongruent with each other. And so, yeah, I think that like any sufficiently advanced economy will be indistinguishable from socialism. To kind of steal language, but at this point, I don't even know. I'd have to do research to find out whether or not Gene Roddenberry was a socialist. Are you okay with right-wingers being in your live chat? Some of our comrades are neurodivergent. It is upsetting them to see right-wingers spread their rhetoric in anarchist spaces. This is an interesting policy question, is it not? I have to think about. So there's two minds to go on this, which is one, I want my chat to be a safe space. And I know that that's a stigmatized as fuck word, but a place where you're not going to feel like going into the chat is like going to war, if that makes sense. On the other hand, there is still the civil libertarian in me who wants to say that if you're not dehumanizing others, if you're not acting like a bigot, then like would it not be good to expose people who disagree on these issues to these kinds of places? And I would be interested in knowing what I don't have a good solution to that. In my mind, if someone's not being a prick, then it's not a bad thing to let them discuss things if they're doing so in good faith and they're doing so in the art of wanting to learn more about other people's positions. But if they are insisting on being a jerk and dismissive and oppressive, then they will get the boot, because that's not conducive to a productive conversation. But in my mind, shutting people out of hand leads to me having this conversation with a bunch of people who already know what my answer is going to be, and it doesn't really matter. I would like to think, compared to other YouTube leftists, that if you were to treat it like it was a sales funnel, that I'm more on the wider end of it, and I can speak to people who are a little bit more curious about leftist politics than diehard believers, and that, I might be convincing people to then go on and learn more about things. I hope. That's my hope. And I hope that it's not too upsetting to just let right-wing people exist, and instead try, as long as they're not being dicks, just be cool. And if they are dicks, then they get the boot. So, I don't know. All right. All right. How are we on time? Okay, we're all right. How would the world change once we started mining asteroids? Thinking of all that abundance of rare metals. There's two ways to look at that. So one, Waldo, I would say that it depends upon the adoption of the technology. So there's a couple things to mention. One of which, the biggest one, I think, is the idea of how would I say this? There's the issue of the gravity well. That's the big thing. So we could have unlimited gold and unlimited platinum, but if it's too difficult to get reliably to the Earth in a safe manner, or to go and get said asteroids and bring them to Earth in a safe way, then in some ways I think that a lot of what we'll get in space will more help us develop things in space than on the ground, depending upon what the price of getting these minerals is. Because I think that, in many ways, the price, how much it would cost per ounce of gold to beat what it is on Earth to make it economical, I don't know. I don't know when that would be. I don't know when that technology would be hit. But I do think that it will help boost the space industry of making stations and running industry in space, which we don't really do at the moment, because we don't really have raw materials in space, or at least the space that we get to now. If we could get things on the ground, I could see, the idea of metal and mineral wealth getting cheaper would be interesting. It depends upon what materials are common. If I remember, gold is found often, which gold is used in electronics and things like that. So that, and also it's one of the cornerstones of how the global economy works. So that could be interesting. that could lead to some interesting price fluctuations. That would lead to maybe some electronics being cheaper. If we end up with, I think the big thing that could really change is if something like coltan or uranium or something like that is found in an asteroid in a plentiful amount, because like lowering the very rare mineral that we need to make touch screens, that at the moment we only really get by exploiting slave labor in the Democratic Republic of Congo, is huge. That could change the way the global economy functions. Places where these are big deals could have huge economic depressions. The people who are getting it could be fancifully rich. Who knows where it would go? Also, though, when it comes to mining, a lot of miners tend to be pretty aware of the global economy, and so there might even be like limits on how much they can sell from asteroid mining in order to keep the world economy stable. Like they won't just like flood the market with it. But yeah. Did medieval kings have as little free time as working class people in the modern West? I don't think so. I don't think medieval kings did very much at all. They made a few decisions, and then for the most part, they just kind of did whatever they wanted. Medieval kings tended to leave their job for sometimes years to like go on campaign or something, and they mostly had people who handled the day-to-day activities of the kingdom. So kings were, I think it probably depended a lot on the how micromanagey they were, but for the most part, I think that ruling was for a king was considered more like about, you know, war and things like that. I don't know if there's been many kings who were like interested in infrastructure repair programs and things like that. Do Stefan Molyneux and Douglas Murray might also be playing a big part in radicalizing kids who might turn to the far right for answers? Who do you think, or who do you think there's something else a bit darker behind it? Big part of radicalized kids who might turn to the far right for answers. Do you think there's something else a bit darker behind it? I think that those people are becoming fascists, or they are already, and they want to make more of them because they want their their like, you know, race to dominate over others. I think it comes from the reactionary threat to seeing other people succeed, and the glacial march towards equality that we're having. There's a book called Backlash that you might want to speak more about. I should probably read it at some point. It seems to be becoming more and more relevant these days. But basically about how eras of social progress tend to create an era of regressive reactionary backlash to it. The 1960s and 70s had the 1980s. The 1920s and 30s and 40s had the 1950s, and all sorts of stuff like that. How much of Polite Conversations had you listened to before the stream? You seem surprised by stuff she said on the show many times. I'd listened to the show like a long time ago, but no, I had not been kept caught up. I don't listen to a ton of podcasts. There are too many. And I don't have a ton of time in my day. So that's my answer. um, though now that we're like friends, I think like the thing is like I try to keep up with podcasts of people who are like friends of mine, and like YouTube channels by people that I'm friends with, and so I'm gonna try to listen to it more regularly. Weren't Trotskyists critical towards the USSR from the beginning? I don't know. I thought Trotskyists wanted to. They wanted the USSR to start a global socialist Red Army that would just overthrow capitalism around the world, if I remember correctly. Yeah. Off-topic question. Can you tell me about your D&D campaign with Thought Slime? Well, Robert Corbin, if that is your real name, Thought Slime. Yeah, sure. It's a campaign that's been going for about a year. Features Thought Slime and my friend Kelly and my partner Kelly, and a few other friends, two of which I found on Reddit. When I was going to start a D&D campaign. I asked if anybody in Toronto wanted to join a YouTube group or a D&D campaign. They both said yes. Then when we had our session 0, Kelly was uncomfortable with the fact that we had a group of all men and then her. This was before Thought Slime came out as non-binary, so so I decided to try to find another woman in the group who could join us. So I went on Facebook and I found somebody, because it's D&D's got a lot of online tools to find a group. So we had that group, and then we started playing for a number of months. And after a few months, I was looking for a second D&D night because I wanted to play a character at some point. And so a few friends of one of the players named Michael asked me to join their campaign. I played in that for a bit. And there's this guy in the group named Spencer who then was having such a fun time that I asked him to join our group too. The campaign's been going on since about early August of 2018. It's level 10. I don't know what else we want to say. It's focused in a area of the campaign setting that I made up that is roughly has a similar idea to Brazil. It's very tropical. There's a lot of issues with colonization. Basically, the party is a group of either indigenous people to this region or people sympathetic to their cause, or people, for example, Thought Slime's character is a wanted criminal who's on the run from the law and went to this region to sort of get away from the law. And they're sort of building a new society and leading a campaign to dismantle the colonial authority in the region. And now that they're level 10, things are getting to the point where it's like, okay, now it's time to save the world from Lovecraftian monsters and stuff like that. So that's the general rundown. What do you think are some of the positive aspects of masculinity that we as a society should champion more of? That's actually a really good way to frame that. So I think there was a discussion about toxic masculinity in the chat, and I think that there is a common misinterpretation that toxic masculinity is in some way trying to say that masculinity itself is toxic. And I think that there are traditionally masculine traits that are good, that are positive. For example, I think that the 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 grit and loyalty part of masculinity is a perfectly acceptable aspect of masculinity. The emphasis on protecting others and being somebody who tries to, how would I say it? Like being somebody who looks out for you and yours, and you're being the person, the strong person that other people rely on. I think that now you can't be that all the time, but I think that there is value to doing that, to being there for others, and that kind of stuff. I just gotta try to think about all the things that were great about my dad. Are great about my dad. My he's fine. He's great. So like, it's all of that. There's being a person who's always there to advise, a person who's always there to, I think it's very much about being there for people. I think that is a masculine trait, and being and protecting people and keeping people from harm. I think that those are traditionally masculine traits that are definitely great, that we could definitely emphasize. Yeah. What do you think of the Paul Joseph Watsons of the world claiming both sides on recent shootings? It's bullshit. I mean, there have been some, I think like the closest thing to what would be called a left-wing motivated shooting there was one shooting in at a baseball game, a Republican baseball game, where one guy shot the players who were like Republican politicians. Can't get more cut and dry than that. But like, claiming both sides is bullshit, because like, it's so one-sided. That is one case. And also, there's a difference when, like, for example, say the two shootings that happened yesterday, where one is a white nationalist who drove 600 miles to El Paso, where he published a manifesto in support of the Christchurch shooter. And he published a manifesto saying that he was against the invasion of non-white people, specifically Latinx people, into America, into Texas, which it's all so many levels of ironic, but whatever. And literally committed a racist, politically motivated murder, i.e. terrorism. The shooting that happened in Dayton was done by a socialist, which is actually pretty rare. You don't see that too often these days. But it seems that when you look at the event itself, it's not looking like the same story. There's no manifesto. The guy was politically active, but this seems to have been motivated more by personal hatred and misogyny than like a literal political statement, like the El Paso shooter. And so in my mind, it's not like, this is about somebody being misogynistic and having issues with women and, toxic aspects of their masculine identity, than it is about having a manifesto and committing an act of terrorism. Like, this isn't like the 1900s, where you had like anarchists like killing right-wing politicians and stuff like that. That's just not a thing that happens anymore. Or I shouldn't say it's a thing that never happens, but it is a thing that is very, very rare compared to the very, very prevalent and rising tide of right-wing white nationalist mass violence going on, especially in the United States, but around the world. like Christchurch happened too, and in Canada we had a mass shooting with Alexandre Bassanet, who shot up a mosque in Quebec City in 2017. So it's becoming a thing everywhere. Is Doug Ford's election a symbol of what's to come in Canadian politics? Yes and no. In many ways, Doug Ford's election has a lot to do with the local situation in Ontario. Doug Ford's election comes at the end of 12 years of Liberal rule. A Liberal rule that was extremely corrupt and had basically like open disdain for poor people. So they had like really given like Liberals are centrists in Canada. So after like this like center right rule for 12 years, especially under Kathleen Wynne, there was a lot of like animosity towards her, and the Liberal Party in general. And like the election before Doug Ford's election, which was in 2014, people thought that was going to be the election in which the Liberals got bumped out of power too, because she and the like Kathleen Wynne and the Liberal Party had just such low approval rates. But then the Conservatives came up with this guy named Tim Hudak, and like he was like an absolute disaster. He promised these absolutely terrible cuts to the government, and so the Liberals held on to power. So Doug Ford was, before becoming leader of the Conservative Party and winning the election, he was a big player in Toronto politics here. So the things that he came to power on are things that would be considered pretty local to Ontario. He came to power on 12 years of Liberal rule, which, that's a very long time for one party to hold government. He came to power on a lot of local issues that had to deal with like the Liberals putting in a pretty modest sex ed curriculum that social conservatives didn't like. Came to power on just this vague idea of spending. In Ontario, there's this like idea, it's not a correct idea, that somehow conservatives balance the budget. And so they thought that the Liberals were spending too much money. So then they would elect the Conservatives who would fix that. But then when the Conservatives start cutting social services to the bone, but still go in debt because they give massive tax breaks to rich people, then people get mad again, and then they vote the Liberals in again. It's a really dumb cycle that happens in Ontario quite a bit, because people in the GTA are kind of dumb, at least in the suburbs. But in my mind, what's happening at the federal level is, if anything, Ontario is following Canada. This is sort of like what the 2011 election in Canada was like, where the Liberals had been ruling for, well, in this case, the Liberals had been ruling for a long time, and then Conservatives had a few successive minority governments. But then the Liberals just had a leader that no one was inspired by. People were sick of their shit. There was a major scandal involving them, and so people just voted Conservative in huge numbers, and the Liberal Party collapsed, with the NDP becoming the official opposition, which was like the first time in history. Which is what the situation is in Ontario now. I think the Liberals got reduced to something like 10 seats, something like that. And the NDP is the official opposition to the Progressive Conservatives. And so that means that at the end of that sort of moment in the woods, the Liberals came up with Justin Trudeau and turned the tables. But who knows what'll happen in Ontario? But I think that it's Canada's a little too decentralized. I think that Doug Ford, despite being bad, and about the next election in Canada being bad, I think that the forces that got Doug Ford into office are sort of Ontario specific. Does the NDP run any provinces? How are those doing? The NDP used, let me think. I think that the NDP is not running any governments right now, but that changed relatively recently. There's a coalition government in British Columbia between the NDP and the Green Party right now. Because the last British Columbia election, the way that the British Columbia elections work is that the NDP are the left of the election and the Liberals are the Conservatives, and there's no Conservative Party. There's no Conservative Party in BC. But then the Green Party became a big force, and I think that the NDP and the Greens made an alliance or made a coalition government to make sure that the Liberals didn't win or something like that. And then Alberta had an NDP government until this year. There was an election earlier this year in which the NDP government got overthrown by the United Conservative Party of Canada, or the United Conservative Party of Alberta, which is an alliance of the far-right Wild Rose Party and the Progressive Conservatives. And I think going kind of west-east, Saskatchewan is run by the Saskatchewan Party, which is a party that's just in Saskatchewan, and I think it's like a center-right party. Manitoba, I think Manitoba is... Let me see, what's Manitoba's government? Who's the premier of Manitoba? Brian Pallister. Yeah, it's the Conservatives. Okay, so Manitoba's under the Progressive Conservatives. Ontario's under the Progressive Conservatives. Quebec is under the Coalition Avenir Quebec, which is a far-right, well, not far-right, but it's a right-wing nationalist political party. And I think PEI is run by the Green Party. Nope. The premier is a progressive conservative in PEI. And let me see. Nova Scotia? Who's Nova Scotia's premier? Nova Scotia tends to, or what's it called? The Maritimes tends to elect, what's it called? Tend to elect liberals. So my guess is that the current Stephen McNeil, the premier of Nova Scotia, is the Liberal Party. Yeah. And New Brunswick, and I don't know about the other situations. All right, this is a bit much. I feel like going through each province, so I don't think there are any NDP governments right now. Tristan, did you hear about Boris Johnson? Like, in general? Yes. Yes, I have heard about Boris Johnson. I'm not a fan. I feel like I might need to talk about him more. I proposed with American Johnson to do a Johnson & Johnson video about Boris Johnson, but he's on vacation right now, so I'll talk to him when he gets back. Your rationale for not wanting to criticize religions, why doesn't it apply to other ideologies? Why don't you think criticizing fascist communities from the outside is counterproductive? Because religion and political movements are very different. Religion is about dictating terms about people inside of their religion, not for the entire world. On top of that, religion is a much deeper and different set of things than a political ideology. A religion is connected to culture and nation, and it's part of language. It's part of so many parts of someone's identity that they're intertwined in a way that is difficult for an outsider to get involved with. Fascism is an ideology, a political ideology for how the world should be and how who should and should not have power. And in a political ideology, deciding who does not have power is a matter of life and death for some people. Fascists want to commit genocide. And trust me, if a religion ever openly wanted to commit genocide, I would give it some shit too. So, there you go. All right. Let's see. Which YouTube format is more effective? The artistic avant-garde essay style of Philosophy Tube, or an unrehearsed off-the-cuff vlog like Beau of the Fifth Column? I think that the avant-garde video essay of Philosophy Tube would definitely be more effective. Philosophy Tube is like Ollie's stuff. YouTube is such a crowded space that like you need to make something truly amazing and weird to stand out of the very noisy space that is YouTube. And so having things that are avant-garde and big and strange is what's going to get people's attention. And I mean, I don't know if you saw, but Ollie's latest video got him profiled by Vox. He's been like cited on NPR and like all sorts of stuff. ContraPoints, similar story, getting all of the news, all of the coverage. And I think like that's definitely showing that like that is more of a successful way to go. What about religions that just excommunicate all of the would-be reformers? Last year, LDS literally excommunicated a guy who was campaigning against child abuse in temple spaces. Yeah. Well, I would encourage that they do not do that. I would think that that is a counterproductive thing for the Mormon Church to do. And I would say, you shouldn't do that, Mormon Church. You should let different ideas flourish. So there you go. But you know what isn't constructive is to say, oh, you excommunicated a reformer. Well, did you know that you are all polygamy bad? You're bad. Did you know that Mormon bad? I'm sure the Mormons will respond real well to that. All right. How advanced was technology in the USSR and Cuba under communism, and what technological advancements and achievements were made besides space technology? I can't like give you a full list of all of these things, but the USSR did develop a lot of technology. The big thing that really kind of fucked up the USSR is they were doing really well in like the mid-century, but then the Soviet system had an issue with boss pleasing, and the USSR never got into, in a big way, investing their scientific resources into developing technology surrounding computers. So their like IT development was nowhere close to the United States, and that happened to turn into a winning bet for the United States. And at a certain point, by like I think the late 60s or something like that, the USSR was just stealing American computers and just using those. I think that the decision not to invest in computers was what started to put the USSR further and further behind in the 70s and the 80s. So that's a thing. Hey, Phoebes. They're all talking about you. Do you believe the moon landing was faked? No. I think it would have been tougher to fake the moon landing than that. Menu. Laura was here. You just said menu. So that's a fun. It's a Quebecois term. Menu means like it's sort of like a pastiche. It's kind of like a twist on the word mignon, which in French means sort of like little, like in an endearing way, like "aw, my little guy," but it also means cute and like endearing, mignon, and so menu kind of becomes that. But then on top of that, menu in Quebec has also kind of just kind of like almost like kind of standing in for in English the word kitty, and so kitty menu, and then on top of that, for some reason I don't know why, in Quebec there's just a lot of cats named Menu, and so they just go menu, and it's like kitty, but also it means cute, but also it's just a name for a lot of cats. So it's a really often used term in Quebec. It's kind of weird. This is a very sweet kitty, and she's a little upset the last couple days because we've started feeding her at night instead of in the morning, because then we can sleep. It has done wonders for my sleep schedule so far, but it means that the kind of like squirreliness and annoyingness that cats get when they're hungry starts to happen basically starting in the early afternoon until I feed them in the evening. And don't say I'm not feeding them enough, because they are perfectly plump, round cats. Suppose Yellowstone erupted in 299 AD. Could that have made the Iron Age humanity revert back to hunter-gatherer state, almost a decade of failed harvests around the world? Yeah, definitely could have. Your grandma's cat was named Manu. Yeah. If a socialist was running for the House of Representatives in the U.S., is it okay for them to hide their ideas and socialist leanings to help them get elected? I wouldn't lie about it, but I definitely think that if you're a socialist running for the House, you should not say the word socialism, because a lot of times in America, it's very easy for people to like a lot of the cat. Wait, why am I saying cat? A lot of the ideas of socialism actually pull very well in America, but the word socialism doesn't. And even that is becoming less true. So in my mind, if you're campaigning now, you should just openly say you're a socialist, because then you get like the DSA's help and you get like that, that AOC energy. But if you just advocate for the same ideas while not calling yourself a socialist, trust me, other people will call you a socialist anyway, but might as well. Thoughts on Chapo Trap House? I'm gonna have to really come together on that one. I think it's a podcast I listen to. It's a podcast I listen to a lot and I enjoy. This is why like the discussion of the dirtbag left is so weird to me, because like I don't see them in the same way that like shitty people like Vaush or the hosts of Red Scare are, where like their reactionary bullshit is like vaguely painted over with socialist ideas, while like Chapo Trap House is a podcast, they punch up. They're not like, they don't do the same kind of bullshit that like those other people do. But I feel like it's a podcast that gets lumped in with the wrong people by people who don't listen to it, and also bad categorization. So there's that bad categorization, and it's kind of unfairly treated. But on top of that, they've also prone to the occasional bad take, and getting into conspiracy theories doesn't really make me like. They're kind of like they jokey. They have some jokey defenses of, or they have just some jokey exploration of conspiracy theories that I'm not a big fan of, but whatever it is. I heard Chapo Trap House Defense vouch. That's enough for me. Well, I haven't heard anything about that. We'll see what happens. I typically want to go on things that I know, not things that I've heard from other people, if that makes sense. Have you, Cody, and Emperor Tigerstar talked about reviving / bringing back to life the So That Happened podcast? The last time I spoke to Cody, it was during VidCon, and he didn't talk about it at all. There was like a half-baked idea to get to do like one stream during VidCon, but then after like the first night of VidCon, something happened. I don't know what it was, and he basically disappeared. I think he might have gotten a better ticket, or he ended up having to go to like more fancy things than a lot of us had access to. So we didn't see him again for the rest of the trip. Cody or Emperor Tigerstar occasionally messages me about random things, but no, there's not really much of a discussion about. There's not much discussion about bringing back So That Happened. I don't see that happening. Okay. What's next? Space empires are a big trope in sci-fi. Do you think a society could be advanced enough to travel interstellar space but still find conquering others economically worthwhile? There's different ways to think about that. First of all, empires are built upon the amount of logistics and communication lines of said empire. And given the way that our world seems to be, that you're probably not going to be able to get from one star to another without it taking a few centuries at the very least. And so in that case, I don't think that there's ever going to be an interstellar empire, because if it takes 100 years for a message to get from one side to the other, or like 4 years to get from one side to the other, then it's too long of a line to really maintain a real empire. But at the same time, I don't think there's much need for conquest in a post-scarcity economy, which any society that is running an interstellar empire would be. So, yeah, I don't think so. Unless like there's some like extremely rare resource that only one place in the world has, but or one place in the universe has, but that's different. I don't even know what that would be like. Do you believe ancient astronaut theorists are secretly right-wing conspiracy theorists? I think that from my research into the ancient astronauts people, they run all over the gamut. Some of them are true believers. Some of them are grifters. Like, I think that Eric von Däniken is a grifter. I think that a lot of the people who run Ancient Aliens on the History Channel are grifters. But there are a few true believers. But I do think that maybe less than like right-wing beliefs, there's like a lot of just colonialist overtones and like racist overtones to their beliefs. But ones that might not be like they might not implicitly believe, but they might believe without knowing that they believe it. Did Lobster Dad's whining about gender in school curricula affect Doug Ford's election? Then no. Doug Ford's whining was about a law that was being passed in the federal government about misgendering people and trans rights in general. He did not, as far as I know, speak up at all about the sex ed curriculum, which is what Doug Ford was railing against, which was a sex ed curriculum that was implemented in 2015 that included things like gender not being a binary and talking about consent for talking about consent in the sex ed curriculum. And that was the thing that a lot of social conservatives were angry about. And also that LGBTQ plus people were considered normal. Okay. That question I asked about Cuban doctors, I meant to you think it's moral to force people to spend years helping the poor if they want to do a particular job. I mean, is it moral? I don't see what the problem is. Like, forcing people to do stuff is not great, but also, if you want to be a doctor and you don't want to help poor people, that's a really strange thing for you to want to do, and I don't exactly know what you would do, how you would handle that. But it seems like it's a very useful way to get people to become doctors by doing a thing that is objectively good, so I don't know what the big deal is. Do you think Goku is a socialist? Oh, God. Samantha, what are you doing to me? Is Goku a socialist? I mean, everybody to me is a socialist until proven otherwise. How is Canada going to phase out oil and gas? And do you support pipelines? I do not support pipelines. Pipelines are first of all, they are almost always, for NIMBY reasons, built through communities that have the least power, i.e. they're built through indigenous sovereign territory. They are building permanent infrastructure that is dedicated to a resource that we're supposed to be getting rid of. It's like doubling down on something that we're trying to destroy, trying to end. It's like if you're like, man, oh, it's a phone call. I'll get that later. It's like if you are buying central air for a house that you plan on moving out in like next week, you know? You need to get rid of it. Like you need like oil, like the main thing is to try and the main thing that Canada needs to do to phase out oil is the same thing that America's doing, which is trying to dismantle the petrol industry, and you need to find some way to let Alberta economically transition off of oil in some meaningful way. There's a Green New Deal for Canada too, and I think that we should do that. Coming to September 27th with a global general strike, if we achieve our goal of crashing the global market, what do you think the most likely outcome would be? I do not know. To make a statement to show that there's a lot more support for this kind of politics than people think, that is a definite outcome. There's definitely going to be a lot of people posturing about why the general strike is bad. Actually, we'll debate about it for a while, but I think that there'd be a strong political statement in that. I think a lot of people who work on their political abacuses would definitely see, oh shit, like this is a bigger thing than we thought it was. Shouldn't the left try to appeal to the uneducated working class, and being avant-garde makes you seem elitist? Doesn't art appeal mostly to educated liberal elites? I don't know. Does philosophy tube videos only appeal to liberal elites? Maybe. But I think that putting emphasis on being accessible and being entertaining is a way of getting your stuff to appeal to the working class as well. Because many times, like, translating some of the more obtuse language of the left and the obtuse ideas of the left in ways that are immediately understandable is the key thing. And if making something entertaining and weird that also teaches you stuff, like, that's one way to get people on your side. All right. Suppose I went back in time to 1959 and gave Khrushchev my old Nintendo DS so his scientists could reverse engineer the tech in it. Would that fix the Soviets' computer problem? Yeah, probably. You've given them a modern day microprocessor. Yeah, they would be like leaps and bounds ahead of the United States if that was the case. Has there ever been mistakes in human history that have delayed our advancements, inventions in technology before capitalism was invented? And also, how do you believe feudalism has held us back? There have been moments in human history that delayed our advancements. The Mongols are responsible for a lot of them. The sacking of Baghdad is probably one of the biggest setbacks of humanity. The burning of the Library of Alexandria, pretty high up there too. The destruction of our collective knowledge at a time when it was harder to reproduce, definitely all held us back. The destruction, the Christian destruction of pre-Christian writings and things like that being deemed heretical knowledge destroyed a lot of ancient texts that we will never get back. Some of which might have advanced mathematics and science ahead of our time. And also, like, major things like the Black Death and the Columbian Exchange. While the Columbian Exchange did a lot to advance humanity technologically anyways, wiping out a fifth of humanity, including some very advanced societies, definitely did a lot of damage. Okay. Thoughts on Abby Martin's recent work on Israel? I haven't watched it. I guess it's recently come out, and I'm kind of behind on stuff. But I listened to Abby Martin did an interview on the Vegan Vanguard that I did listen to, and it seems like it was some pretty good and pretty hardcore work. Do you know about Greta Thunberg? No, I don't. What is your porpoise? What is your porpoise on YouTube? Whom is your ideal target audience? Do you reach that audience? I don't know what my porpoise on YouTube is. I did not know that YouTubers get porpoises. It's like some sort of dolphin creature. What is my purpose on YouTube? Which I think is what you probably got auto-corrected or something. So my purpose on YouTube is to address the fact that there's a couple things. One, history is poorly taught outside of universities. The way that history is taught below university level is typically done as a nation-building project. It is superficial. It is not taught to make you a more well-rounded person who sees things in 3 dimensions. It just is taught to make you love your country, to be a good consumer, to be a good capitalist, which I think is fundamentally wrong. And also, a lot of the things that that history media talk about are things that are things that are, in my mind, not really that interesting, and are things that a lot of historians have been working on lately, is stuff that doesn't trickle down into media that much. So the purpose of Step Back was to bring the history of the Academy and get that out to the public in a way that is entertaining and digestible, in the same way that like the History Channel used to be. And on top of that, I think that since Step Back has started, I've also developed a mission of countering reactionary abuses of the past. The past is something that, like, narrative is important. How we got to where we are today and the story we tell ourselves about that says a lot about what our society currently wants to do going forward, and what the arc of morality really is. So, part of my work has also been to reinterpret that story, specifically to counter nationalist and reactionary attempts to, in many cases, they already own the narrative, to counter their narrative with a better one that is more accurate and points us towards a more just society. My ideal target audience for said project were the people who found history when I first started Step Back. It was the people who found history interesting, who wanted to take history classes in university, but they didn't because their parents told them that history wasn't a worthwhile degree, or one reason or another. And my hope was that reaching them, people who were predisposed to like history but didn't get a chance to take it as a formal post-secondary education because they have a lot of enthusiasm for the topic, but because of the lack of access to modern history, were defaulting to, map porn and a lot of nationalistic, war-focused history. And I thought that they would be a group that I could speak to and show them, actually, no, history can, the whole, history that's just, boxes and arrows on maps is so, so over in academic history, and that there's so much more to talk about. There's so many more stories. And I guess, another side thing is I'd like to get people who thought that history wasn't for them because they thought history was just wars and maps and dates and things like that, and talk about no, it's story. It's stories. And I really wanted to get that kind of stuff out there. And do I reach that audience? My analytics say that my audience is primarily between the ages of 24 and 35. So in that sense, yes. Yes, it does. What I discovered after I started Step Back is that there is also a large contingent of young people who are not university aged, who have taken up a big interest in the past. And I've been enjoying my time speaking with them as well. I'm hoping that because history is a place where right-wing narratives and reactionary politics come to play, that this is a space where I can offer an alternative. And so far, there aren't any other history channels that are approaching the past in the same way I am, so I think I am providing a rather unique voice in the field. The closest I would think would be Three Arrows, but even Three Arrows is a very, very narrow focus. So I'm hoping that this is the kind of content that I am making, and that's for the people that's for. And to a certain extent, it seems I've been reaching some of them. the main thing that I think I'm struggling with is that I want to get the people who thought that, like the people of color, the women, the LGBTQ plus people who think that history is just about dead white guys, and telling them and bringing them back into the history fold, saying no, it's about everyone, and that there are great stories that don't just involve dead white guys. Let me show you some of them. Trying to bring them in has been a bit more difficult, which I am perfectly open to learning about advice for how to reach out to those people. Because there are a lot of people who I think would really like Step Back, but because it's a history channel, they feel turned off by it. Dammit Bobby 420, which is a great name which is a great username. What lessons from the old Black Panther Party do we need to learn today to help modern leftists struggle? I think that the way that the Black Panthers functioned that we can learn is that, for some of them anyway, it was an all-encompassing part of their lives. They had very little in the way of infrastructure and resources, and they just believed enough in their cause they could convert everyone to it. And I do think that the idea of, like, the Black Panthers were very media savvy. They knew the political situation that they were coming up in. They knew that they were able to sell themselves as part of the rising anti-colonial movements around the world, and that was something that they could jump into and say, like, look, we are the anti-colonial movement for America. We are the Black Panthers. Like, we're gonna like fight oppression here. And the images of, the Black Panthers with their weapons and all that kind of stuff was a very stark and standout image. And I think that the idea of building on the movements in an international sense, and also like being media savvy, I think, are the things that we need to learn. What are the arguments against a global strike? Oh, just like the typical right-wing bullshit about that are against strikes in general. I think a global strike would be a great idea. If I went back to AD 1111 and exposed Native Americans to Eurasian diseases, so they'd have 381 years to build up immunity. What if I went back? It depends. A lot of indigenous people were fairly spaced out. So, like, theoretically, 255, about 100 years before the time that you're referencing, if that would have solved the issue, then Leif Erikson would have done that with the Vikings in Vinland. So obviously, it probably affected some people, but it had limits. My imagining is it affect some people, but it would be geographically consolidated, if that makes sense. Is it fair to describe the Matrix films as leftist? I mean, they're anti-oppression. They're for, like, unique individuality and stuff over, like, the raw machine that tries to dominate us. There's definitely a right-wing reading or a left-wing reading of that book for sure, or of those movies. What's the most boring aspect of U.S. history? I would say the early colonial America before the Revolutionary War. Colonial America has got some interesting stuff, though. Most boring aspect of history. Oh boy. In my mind, the most boring aspect of history is the people who go super, super, super inside baseball on, like, the royal families of Europe. Like, I find the people who are really, really interested in the family trees of the ruling families of Europe
astonishingly boring. Couldn't you also wish people could accept the concept that mutual aid is a factor of evolution and we can all cooperatively work together for the betterment of all? I do wish that. That would be nice. So you are carrying the legacy of Howard Zinn. I have been called the Howard Zinn of the YouTube history community, and I think that's a title that I am happy to own. When people say they want to decolonize North America, what would that look like? What do they mean? It can't possibly involve sending all the white people back to Europe. No, Laura, that's not really a thing that... I mean, there are some indigenous people who make that argument, but they're very few in number. In many ways, I would think that we would need to decolonize North America would be to return the indigenous people to being the default, like, owners of the land. So there are different ways you could think about that. We could treat the settler colonial nations as tenants of the indigenous people's territory, in which case we're subject to their to paying them and compensating them for living on their territory. But I think that I think that the other option, I think this is one that I've heard about that I'm interested in, which is that letting the indigenous nations become the de facto governments of North America and dissolving the settler colonial states that were built on top of them. So instead of Canada having the different nations like the Anishinaabe and the Attawapiskat, and Attawapiskat, that's not a nation, that is a place. But the different nations being the actual nations, and that the white people would live under those nations, and we would be, this is a region that was ruled by a tribe called the Mississauga, and so I would be living in the Mississauga Nation, and I'd be it would be based on tribal government and things like that, and we would work that way. Here, when people say they want to we read that one. How have claims of socialism been used in the past to attack progressive policies, New Deal era, etc.? Honestly, it wasn't that big of a deal. Socialism wasn't that stigmatized until basically the 50s and the McCarthyist era, and when the government actively started to oppress socialists and make sure that they had no role in government. And ever since then, anything progressive has been called socialist, which has damaged its reputation. So that is why the United States, if you haven't noticed, kind of stopped doing things that the rest of the world did in the 1950s. And now they're like 60 years behind the rest of the world on basic social services that need to be updated. But yeah, I would say that claims of socialism have definitely been used to hold back pretty much any progressive movement since the 1950s in the U.S. What if I went back in time, became Roman emperor, and tried to convert the empire to Marxist-Leninism? Oh boy, what's with all the alternate history scenarios today? I would imagine you'd get some pushback from all of the slave owners. I also imagine you would get pushback from, like, the thing is, like, socialism kind of needs an industrial economy to function. So would you end up being like Stalin, trying to bring the Roman Empire to industrialize fast enough so that it could be the socialist state that you need to make communism, in which case a lot of people would die. Thoughts on the DSA? Sounds like a big, messy organization, but still pretty successful. I would say DSA is typically good. Although I imagine that it's a big, wide organization that has a lot of weirdos in it, so depends on the organization. Is it fair to interpret the Dark Knight as supportive of the war on terrorism? I think it is. Yeah, there is a lot of pro-war on terror overtones to it. Actually, I would probably say that the Dark Knight Rises even more so. The Dark Knight Rises is basically an anti-Occupy Wall Street documentary, or not documentary, movie. Tristan, what if Karl Marx never existed? Do you believe that there would be better ideologies invented than communism? No idea, to be honest. I think somebody would have developed something similar to Karl Marx, because all he really did was systematize a lot of the ideas that were floating around Europe already. Just might have been a different philosopher, might have been slightly different. How can we possibly compensate for centuries of war, genocide, theft, rape, destruction of culture, etc.? That is a very good question, and I would think that we would definitely need to do a lot of reparation payments and rebuilding and allowing for stuff, and yeah. But there's never going to be all right, we paid you enough money, we're now square. I don't think it'll ever be truly square. How these new, or I guess old native states work? Would non-natives become second-class citizens? I doubt it. That's not really what indigenous people are like. Tribal governments are very much about consensus building and long-term planning. I feel like these states would end up being way better than the ones we have now. There's the whole principle of stuff that you need to do, every decision you need to make, you have to consider 7 generations down the line and stuff like that, which I think would be way more preferable to what we have now. What are your thoughts on Mastline? Is it effective and does it produce long-term results? I don't know what that is. What if the Populares had success? I don't know what the Populares are either. I'm not much of I think that's a Roman thing that I don't know much about. All right. Where are we getting to? I think we're coming to the end of our time. It is 1:57, and I got a lot of work to do. So I think we're gonna call it here. But this has been a fun stream. You guys have been really active, and that's great. I'm going to be back. If you have any more questions, I'll be back tomorrow night, hopefully. I have a deadline on Wednesday, so we'll see where I'm at by that point. But yeah, hang on, and I'll see you when I see you next, buddy.